You're watching Silver News Daily. Subscribe for more.
Almost all the architecture that we know today of globalism, of global governance, was born in the aftermath of World War II. Whether you're looking at the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, even the European Union. And over the next few decades, that rapidly morphed into this super state that we know today as the European Union, that in many ways has more power than the federal government does. They understand that war is an accelerator for the cause of globalism. So I think war is a very real possibility, and I think it would absolutely serve the interests of those who are trying to undermine national sovereignty and reshape the global order.
What if I told you the most explosive financial event of our lifetime is already in motion, and almost nobody sees it coming? As the dollar teeters on the edge of collapse and the world's wealthiest institutions scramble for gold, one metal remains suspiciously silent: silver. But don't let the calm fool you. Beneath the surface, pressure is building, fast. Central banks are hoarding gold at record levels, the BRICS nations are abandoning the dollar, and talk of a new monetary system is no longer theory. It's policy. War drums are beating from Ukraine to Taiwan, and each conflict brings us one step closer to the kind of global panic that sends safe haven assets through the roof. Yet silver, the most undervalued asset in the market, still trades as if none of this matters. That's about to change. In the chaos of revalued gold, collapsing fiat, and engineered crisis, silver won't just rise, it could explode past $500 in a rush unlike anything we've ever seen. So the question isn't if silver will go parabolic. The real question is, will you be ready when it does?
Very good question. I suspect the economy would be in far worse shape than it is now. I expect and this may sound like I'm just being melodramatic, but I expect that we would probably see a lot of well-known freedom fighters actually prosecuted and jailed. I spoke with some very high-profile, very well-known individuals from the conservative nonprofit world, even from the political world, who literally and seriously believed that if Kamala Harris had won, they were going to be thrown in jail for climate denial, for supporting January 6th too vociferously. So I think we dodged a bullet. I don't think we're entirely out of the woods yet, but I think if Kamala Harris had been elected, we probably would have seen revolutionary level change with a goal of making it impossible to ever turn back. So they would have tried to provide amnesty for the tens of millions of illegal aliens they let in, put them on a path to voting, basically do to the nation what they did to California, create a permanent Democrat voting bloc that could never be overcome. And from there, it would be very, very rapid. The governor of California has already very publicly, with support from the legislature, started calling for a constitutional convention to, they're saying it's just to repeal the Second Amendment, but I suspect they have much, much broader goals than that. And so I think that's the kind of direction we would head in. It would be an effort to uproot the old system of government, our constitutional Republican form of government, and replace it with something much more akin to what we see in, say, Western Europe.
To understand where we're heading, we have to go back to where it all began, right after World War II. That's when the architecture of modern globalism was first laid. The United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the European Union, all of them rose from the ashes of war, each promising peace, order, and prosperity. But behind the curtain, something else was happening. These institutions didn't just unify. They centralized, and in doing so, they quietly began eroding the sovereignty of nations. Today, that system has matured into a kind of superstate, one that increasingly dictates monetary policy, environmental regulations, and global trade flows. But here's the twist. War isn't a threat to this system. It's a tool. Every major conflict has served to tighten globalist control. Whether it's NATO expansion, Middle Eastern regime change, or rising tensions in the South China Sea, war consolidates power and destabilizes local economies. And what happens during destabilization? Panic, flight to safety. And that's where silver enters the frame. Because when missiles fly and markets plunge, investors don't run to tech stocks. They run to tangible assets. And while gold usually gets the spotlight, silver is the stealth missile. It's cheaper, faster moving, and when it catches fire, it burns hotter than anything else on the market. If war accelerates the globalist agenda, then it also accelerates silver's role as a safe haven asset. And with the world now teetering on multiple geopolitical flashpoints, that ignition moment may be dangerously close.
About it. And in fact, I think it would be very foolish and naive to think that all the threats suddenly evaporated on January 20th. And I'm not one of those people who gets into cheerleader mode and says, Trump uber alles, Trump can do no wrong, Trump is the de facto savior of America. I'm glad he got elected. I think he's been doing a lot of good things, but I think it would be very foolish not to examine each policy with just an open mind, right? We don't have to agree. We're not Democrats. We don't have to agree with every single thing dear leader does to be patriotic. I'm very pleased with a lot of what he's done. I've followed the climate issue for 15 years now in my journalistic career, and I could not have designed a better program myself to smash this machinery. Now, will we succeed in smashing it? That remains to be seen. Right now, all of it has really been through the executive branch, and we need congressional action to get these things made permanent. But there are plenty of things that I think are deeply concerning. Just last week, I wrote an article about his executive order injecting artificial intelligence into every classroom in America. He campaigned on a platform of getting the U.S. government out of education. I think that was a good step in the right direction. But now we're seeing efforts to, once again, have federal interference in the classroom. And frankly, I think there are some really serious dangers from AI. I understand where the president's coming from. This is a very powerful new technology that is going to have a profound impact on the future. We want our children to be familiar with these technologies. We want our children to know how to use them. But there are some really, really serious dangers there. On the economic front, I think there's a risk that the globalists, the evildoers, whatever you want to call them, will try to collapse the economy and blame Donald Trump, whether that be through collapsing the U.S. dollar, collapsing the stock market, collapsing the real estate market, doing all of the above at the same time. I think any of those are real possibilities. And also, of course, the threat of World War III. I do believe that Donald Trump is trying hard to negotiate peaceful solutions to these problems. But as we've seen, there's new flare-ups every day. Now the Indians, I just got back from India a week and a half ago. Now the Indians are launching missiles into Pakistan. The Pakistanis are plotting their retaliation and supposedly backing terrorist attacks. So it's a big mess. You look at Ukraine, Russia, you look at what's going on in the Middle East, now the big attack on Yemen. Any one of these could easily spiral into a third world war. And we know there are very powerful forces that want a third world war. So I was pleased to see Mike Waltz escorted out of the senior role in the national security apparatus. That was an encouraging sign to me. But there are still snakes in the administration where we have some people that I think need to be watched very, very closely. And so, no, by no means has the danger passed. In fact, we may be in an even more dangerous spot right now because so many Americans who otherwise would be paying close attention and resisting evil are now going back to sleep and just cheerleading. And I'll mention one more major risk that I see, and that is an effort, I think, to stir up a civil war in this country. A lot of people who are Trump supporters don't see it because we've all kind of been segregated into our online social media ghettos, and they don't see the incredible anger, the fury, the rage that is building on the other side. And a lot of it is based on fake news. The fake media is stirring them up. The politicians are stirring them up. Trump is going to take your rights away. Trump is going to force you to carry babies. Trump is going to put LGBT people on. It's all ridiculous. But the blue-haired weirdo ready to burn down the city doesn't know that. And so I think there really is an effort to stir up a civil war in this country to try to force Trump to respond as the dictator that they're trying to portray him as. So we've got all these major risks, and I think people would be wise to pay close attention.
But geopolitical tension is just one side of the coin. The other is economic sabotage happening right in front of our eyes. Because what we're witnessing isn't just market mismanagement. It's a controlled demolition of the U.S. economy. For decades, America was the engine of global growth. But then came offshoring, endless debt spending, and the deindustrialization of the heartland. This wasn't accidental. It was systematic. Supply chains were gutted, manufacturing was shipped overseas, and fiscal policy became a game of smoke and mirrors. Trillions in printed money, ballooning deficits, and interest rates that no longer reflect economic reality. And where does that leave the dollar? Teetering. The foundation of global trade now sits on a currency that is being actively diluted And as confidence in the dollar evaporates, central banks aren't waiting around. They're buying gold, quietly, aggressively, relentlessly. Why? Because they know what's coming. A reset, a shift away from fiat, a revaluation of real money. And while gold leads that charge, silver rides in its shadow, waiting. Every major monetary shift in history has had a second phase. Gold spikes first. But silver erupts. Not just because it's a monetary metal, but because its price is more volatile, more reactive, and far more suppressed. When the dollar loses its grip and trust in fiat breaks, silver doesn't need permission to move. It just needs a crack in the system. And that crack is now a fault line.
I think there's several ways to look at this. My assessment of the situation we're in is we were witnessing the controlled demolition of the United States of America in every important respect. Right? I mean, it doesn't mean that the lines on the map would cease to exist. It doesn't mean that the federal government would cease to exist. But the America that we knew and loved was deliberately being destroyed. And I don't just mean Joe Biden, right? This has been a long-term process. It's been a bipartisan process. Whether you're looking at the Bushes, Mr. George H.W. New World Order Bush, or, even before that, going all the way back to Eisenhower. I mean, there has been a very deliberate and, I believe, strategic effort to use the United States to hijack our political, economic, and military power to rearrange the world order in a particular way. And now that process has largely been accomplished, the United States becomes suddenly an obstacle to the final destination that these people seek. And again, this isn't speculation. If you read their documents, if you listen to their speeches, they're pretty open about this. They want what George H.W. Bush called the New World Order, where a credible United Nations would use its peacekeeping role, in other words, their military forces, to bring about the vision of the UN's founders. Anybody can go find out what the vision of the UN's founders were, right? You had the Soviets, then you had our guy, Al Jarhis, who we eventually threw in prison because he was a spy for Joseph Stalin. We knew what their vision was. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles wrote about it in his book in 1950, War or Peace, that the goal was eventually to turn the UN into a world government with teeth in it, as he phrased it in his book. So that's the plan. And if you look at the world order that they themselves say they want to build, it is not compatible with the principles that the United States was founded on. I mean, just go back to read the Declaration of Independence. They said it was a self-evident truth that God created us equally, that he endowed us with certain unalienable rights. None of those ideas are compatible with the kind of global political, economic, and even religious system that these people want to impose on us. And that means that America is officially an obstacle. And so we have seen now over at least a 40-year period, an effort to deindustrialize the United States, an effort to ship our productive capabilities over to communist China, over to other parts of the world, even Mexico, by the way. And I don't say that with any animosity to Mexico or even the Chinese. I grew up overseas. I've been overseas almost all my life. It's just an objective fact. American policymakers have deliberately undermined our economy. They've deliberately destroyed the middle class that was once vibrant and the backbone of resistance to tyranny. And that's the goal that they're moving toward. Now, will they be able to jump into the one world system in one go? No, they won't. But what they're trying to do right now is undermine what's left of the United States. And I do believe Trump is trying to push back on this. So we saw this struggle even in 2016. They were saying, well, America is over. The days of prosperity are over. We're never going to be energy independent again. Trump managed to turn around on a dime. We became energy exporters, net exporters for the first time since Eisenhower in a matter of just a couple of years. So it's possible to reverse this, but this engineered decline is not happening organically. Again, I think controlled demolition is the best metaphor. And they're not giving up just because Donald Trump is the president. I think, again, he's holding them back. He's kind of hit the pause button. We may have a little bit of a reprieve here, but eventually there's going to be another election. Then eventually we're going to have another deep state puppet in the White House. And I think that process will resume unless important safeguards are put into place right now while we have the opportunity to do it.
And that monetary reset isn't just theory. It's inching closer to reality with every passing month. Under the radar, whispers are growing louder about a return to sound money. Donald Trump, love him or hate him, has floated the idea of gold-backed treasuries. And with pro-gold economists like Judy Shelton in his orbit, the possibility of a formal gold revaluation is no longer just fantasy. It's policy discussion. But here's where silver's story really catches fire. Because if gold gets revalued, say, to $10,000 an ounce to rebalance global debt. The historic gold-to-silver ratio becomes a detonator. Historically, silver has traded at a 15-to-1 ratio to gold. Today, it's closer to 80-to-1. If gold explodes, silver doesn't just follow, it slingshots. A revalued gold market would force a recalibration in silver's price so dramatic it would make $500 silver not just possible, but probable. This isn't unprecedented. It's happened before. When gold surged in 1980, and again in 2011, silver followed with amplified intensity. But this time, the setup is even more extreme. The global debt bubble is larger, the dollar is weaker, and the confidence in fiat is far more fragile. If the monetary order resets, and all signs suggest it will, silver becomes the wildcard asset that rewrites the rules. Not tomorrow. Not someday. Soon.
I think that is eventually the plan, right? And whether it starts with a real or a false flag event is really immaterial. There are very powerful forces, not just in Russia, not just in China, but even here in the United States, that are hoping to see a major catastrophic global war. And that's not my opinion. Again, if you go back to the early 1960s, the U.S. State Department hired a guy called Lincoln Bloomfield to write a report. And all you really need to know is the title of the report. It kind of gives the whole agenda away. It's called A World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations. And the goal of this report was to figure out how do we get from where we were then, basically the Westphalian system, going back to the mid-1600s of sovereign or relatively sovereign nation states, to the kind of system that they wanted, which was a world effectively controlled by the United Nations. And in this report, he outlines his views on the best ways to make that happen. He says that through organic processes, this would take hundreds of years to get us there. But he says there's a way to short circuit the process and accelerate it very dramatically. And he says the most important tools to bring that about: war, the threat of war, and crises. So when the World Economic Forum talks about a polycrisis, potentially involving an economic collapse, a third world war, environmental disasters, etc., we need to take these people very, very seriously. Now, there's several angles to look at this from, right? I believe the plan is for the United States to lose the Third World War. And I don't believe very many people, even who are involved in the execution of this plan, understand it fully. But there's a couple of facts that I think are really important to kind of understand the whole puzzle that we're looking at here. One document that I would refer people to that I think is especially critical to understanding what's happening here are the books that were released by, I believe, the most important Soviet defector of all time. His name was Anatoly Golichin. He defected from the Soviet Union. He was a high-ranking officer in KGB's Department D, which was the disinformation department. And he said that back in the 1960s and even into the 70s, they were working on long-range disinformation plans. And he gave many examples. The so-called Sino-Soviet split was a very obvious one, right, where the Soviets and the Communist Chinese pretended to be at odds with each other. And then Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon went in and said, oh, we'll be friends with China to contain the Soviet Union. I mean, what an idiotic thing. Hard to imagine that Americans fell for that, but they did. And in these two books, it's called New Lies for Old and the Perestroika Deception. He first told the CIA, the FBI, Canadian intelligence, they were not interested. So he finally went to the American people with this and put these two books out in the early 1980s. He gave a series of over 200 predictions, about 205, maybe 206, very specific predictions about what was going to happen based on his insider knowledge from Department D and the KGB. And of those 205, 206 predictions, about 200 have come true to the letter. He even gave names of people who were going to be involved in this. He said there would be fake anti-communist revolutions across Eastern Europe. He said the Soviet Union would collapse, but all the communist evildoers would remain in power, right? This wasn't like the denazification process where Nazi war criminals were hung or had to escape to South America. The Soviets just rebranded themselves, right? They went from communist commissar to businessman and picked up state assets for pennies on the dollar, and suddenly they're billionaires, right? Same people, same control, just a slightly new mask. So he predicted that all of this was going to happen. Again,
nowhere is that fault line more visible than in the rise of the BRICS alliance. What started as a loose economic pact has morphed into a full-scale rebellion against dollar dominance. China, Russia, India, Brazil, South Africa, they're not just building trade relationships. They're building an entirely new monetary framework, one that doesn't rely on the US dollar, one that doesn't bend to Western central banks. And here's the part most people miss. These nations aren't stacking dollars. They're stacking gold, tons of it, quietly moving reserves out of treasuries and into tangible wealth. They see the writing on the wall. They know the dollar's days are numbered. And when these countries start settling oil, gas, and raw materials in currencies backed by commodities, especially gold, the ripple effect will be seismic. The dollar's utility will collapse. Its demand will vanish. And when that happens, the flight out of fiat will be biblical. But gold won't be the only beneficiary. Silver, as gold's monetary twin, will go ballistic. Historically, whenever gold is revalued higher, silver follows, only faster and more violently. And in this new multipolar financial order, silver isn't just a hedge, it's a rebellion. A rebellion against fake money, financial manipulation, and the illusion of infinite credit. BRICS is building the escape hatch. And silver? Silver is the currency that will light the way out.
Even gave names, people like Lech Walesa in Poland, who's known as this big anti-communist hero, the leader of the Solidarity movement. Now we know from Soviet documents his code name was Bolek. He was a Soviet agent. So a lot of this was orchestrated in advance. And the reason I'm bringing all this up is because he talks about the grand finale here in these books. And the final prediction, which has not come true yet, obviously, is what he describes as a second October revolution, where the communist Chinese, the Russians, and their allies around the world, once they are sufficiently strong, once they have the ability to take down the United States of America, would join forces, and there would be a catastrophic, devastating war that would take out the weakened and degenerate United States. And I believe there is a carefully orchestrated plan to make that a reality. I don't think it's out of the question that we could see nuclear bombs drop on America from Russia. Now, will that happen next week? I don't know. Could it happen next week? Absolutely. So I think we're in great danger. And I don't say that to scare people. I say that because these things are important to understand if you want to try to get a sense of where the world is going. And I don't think it's too late to stop them necessarily. But Donald Trump needs to be very careful. Again, he's got snakes in his administration who I think would very much like to see a war with Russia. Maybe not because they're conspirators in some big design, but because they think that's the best policy for the United States. But this is a very precarious situation. And the Russians have made very clear that if they feel the existence of the Russian state is threatened, they will use nuclear weapons. They have said it as loudly and as clearly as they possibly can. So this is nothing to mess around with. And if it doesn't happen with Russia, they could start it off in the Middle East, right? It might start with Iran. It might start with North Korea, right? EMP attack. There's all kinds of different ways that they could kick this process off. And the eventual goal would be to use the fallout from this Third World War to finally and forever abolish the concept of national sovereignty. And they've got a track record. If you look back, World War I was hugely successful from the perspective of advancing globalism. Millions of people dead.
Just before we get going, we just launched the official Silver News Daily Telegram. To kick things off, we're running a 10-ounce silver giveaway. Yes, real physical silver, not a voucher, not digital credits, actual bullion. This Telegram will be our new home for real-time silver discussions, market insights, collection picks, and everything precious metals. It's where the community truly comes alive. Here's how to enter the 10-ounce silver giveaway. Be subscribed to Silver News Daily on YouTube. Turn on the notification bell. Comment 10-ounce giveaway on 3 separate videos. Be an active member of the Telegram group and say hi. Once we hit 500 active Telegram members, we'll pick one lucky winner to receive 10 ounces of silver shipped directly to you. So get in early, stay active. And as BRICS builds their way out of the dollar system, another reality is emerging, one that's even more dangerous to the current financial order: the loss of trust in the dollar itself. This isn't just a geopolitical game anymore. It's a confidence crisis. The U.S. has weaponized its own currency, sanctioning countries, freezing reserves, and turning the global financial system into a political minefield. And the world is responding. Central banks everywhere are de-dollarizing, moving into gold, reducing exposure to U.S. debt, and building alternative systems for global trade. This isn't speculation. It's already happening. The U.S. dollar, once the undisputed king of global finance, is now viewed as unstable, risky, and politically compromised. And what happens when the world stops needing dollars to trade? That demand disappears. The inflation comes home, and the Fed can no longer kick the can. At that moment, the dollar collapses under its own weight. The safety net vanishes, and capital has to find a new home. Silver becomes more than a precious metal. It becomes a lifeboat, not just because of its history as money, but because it's still affordable, still undervalued, and still within reach of everyday investors. When trust evaporates and the dollar loses its grip, silver offers something fiat never can: intrinsic value. And in a world built on debt and illusions, that value becomes priceless.
All the men went and died in the wars. The women were out of the homes and the factories to make the bullets so that the men could fight in the war. The children suddenly ended up in government schools so they could be indoctrinated to believe all this stuff. And the result was the League of Nations. Right? The only reason that didn't take off was because the U.S. Senate said no. After World War II, which, by the way, Rockefellers, the Morgan interests were deeply involved in financing the Nazi war. Even some of the Bushes, right? We go back and look at Senator Prescott Bush, director of Union Bank in New York, busted under the Trading with the Enemy Act for helping to finance the Nazis. What happened after World War II was almost all the architecture that we know today of globalism, of global governance, was born in the aftermath of World War II. Whether you're looking at the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, even the European Union, right? The European coal and steel community was born in the aftermath of World War II, and over the next few decades, that rapidly morphed into this super state that we know today as the European Union, that in many ways has more power than the federal government does. So they understand that war is an accelerator for the cause of globalism. And I'll say one more thing and then hand it back to you, Andy. One of the other things that he calls for in this report is a process of regionalization, and war can help advance that as well. We're actually watching this happen right now in Europe. Vladimir Putin is saying, oh, look at those terrible Europeans, look at terrible NATO. We need to deepen our integration through the Eurasian Union. So Kazakhstan and Armenia, you guys all need to join forces with us, and we're going to create a super state to rival the European Union. Meanwhile, the Europeans and NATO are saying, oh man, look at those terrible Russians, invading Ukraine. We're going to be next. We need to have a single European Union military. We need to bring all of our policies together in Brussels and through NATO. So in both cases here, we see these regional governments that Lincoln Bloomfield advocated, that Henry Kissinger advocated in his book World Order, that Zbigniew Brzezinski, national security advisor to Jimmy Carter, Trilateral Commission founder, advocated for very publicly. So I think war is a very real possibility, to just summarize really quick. And I think it would absolutely serve the interests of those who are trying to undermine national sovereignty and reshape the global order.
But silver's story doesn't end with monetary chaos, because while the financial system unravels, silver is experiencing a renaissance of industrial demand, unlike anything in history. It's no longer just a hedge against inflation or a backup currency. Silver has become the metal of progress. Solar energy? Silver is essential for photovoltaic cells. Electric vehicles? Every single one uses silver in its wiring and battery systems. 5G infrastructure, medical devices, even water purification. Silver is embedded in every cutting-edge technology pushing humanity forward. And here's the twist. This industrial demand isn't optional. It's mandated. Governments worldwide are pushing for decarbonization, electrification, and renewable energy at breakneck speed. Trillions are being poured into this transition, and silver is at the core of it. But while demand surges, supply can't keep up. Mines are underproducing, exploration is stalling, and recycling can't fill the gap. That's a setup for an explosion, because this time, silver isn't just riding gold's coattails, it's getting pulled by two forces at once. On one side, collapsing fiat drives monetary demand. On the other, the global tech revolution accelerates industrial need. And when those two currents meet, the pressure on silver's price becomes unbearable. Something has to give. And when it does, we're not talking small gains. We're talking vertical movement.
Showed up. But if you look at the world order that they are publicly calling for, it's exactly the same kind of vision that we see expressed by the Western globalists, right? For example, the G77 plus China. This is the largest alliance, a block of governments within the UN General Assembly. They call it G77. It's actually about 134 governments now, including Communist China. They control the vast majority of the world's population, a huge segment of the world economy. They met about a decade ago in Bolivia toward a New World Order to Live Well conference. The Secretary General of the UN at the time was there, Ban Ki-moon. And I encourage people to just go read this declaration. Right? They call for empowering the United Nations in global governance, having the UN take over prosecution of terrorism. They call for turning the UN into an instrument of economic global governance. And if you read the BRICS declarations that they come out with every year, same thing, right? They call for turning the UN into the UN General Assembly into an emblem of global sovereignty. And so this world order that is being built, they want to frame it as like an East versus West kind of thing. And in one way it kind of is. The problem is the alleged leaders of the West have deliberately brought this situation about. They have deliberately built up communist China into a superpower with a military that now very easily rivals the military of the United States of America. They've been destroying our economy and destroying our military while transferring that over to China under all kinds of different pretexts, right? First, it was containing the Soviet Union. The more recent one is the climate change, right? We're going to shut down our power plants. We're going to shut down our industries so we can ship them all to China. And somehow that's supposed to make the weather better. I mean, people are so unbelievably gullible. But this is all happening by design. And that's because the new system that they want is modeled on what's going on in communist China right now, right? And it's not exactly communism, right? A lot of people make the mistake of calling this communism just because it's run by the Communist Party of China. It is totalitarianism, very ruthless totalitarianism. Remember, the dictatorship in China has murdered more people than any government in the history of man. We're talking at least 100 million of their own people.
And that vertical movement becomes almost inevitable when you realize just how deep the supply crunch really runs. For 4 consecutive years, the world has faced a growing silver deficit, consuming far more than it produces. The easy silver is gone. What's left is buried, deeper, costlier to extract, and increasingly tied up in geopolitical red zones. And with industrial demand eating into inventories at a historic pace, the squeeze is accelerating. This isn't just a supply issue, it's a systemic failure. Stockpiles that once acted as a buffer are vanishing. The COMEX and LBMA are bleeding physical silver. Premiums on actual bullion are spiking. And while paper contracts still control the spot price, the physical market tells a different story, one of scarcity, desperation, and rising premiums. This is where the dam breaks. Because when demand outpaces supply in a commodity this vital, you don't get a gradual repricing. You get a detonation, a short squeeze, a physical run, and once silver's artificial lid is blown off, there's no telling how far it can go. The paper price becomes irrelevant. What matters is how much actual metal is left and who controls it. And that's why companies like Dolly, Varden, Silver are now on every serious investor's radar. They're not just betting on price. They're racing to find the last great deposits before the rest of the world wakes up.
Not including the forced abortions. There's no other government in history that has been so murderous. The control they exercise over the estimated 1.5 billion people they rule is unlike anything we've ever seen in human history with the social credit scores. There is absolutely no freedom beyond that little bit that's allowed so that the economy doesn't collapse. That's the model they want for the world. That's why the middle class in America has been destroyed. That's why our industries and our technology have deliberately been shipped over to China under various pretexts. And that's why when we see this massive alliance forming, the Russians, the Chinese, the Brazilians, the South Africans, and you can see the connections between the Western globalists and the rise of these very governments to power. You go back far enough, you can actually watch the U.S. government betray the nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek in China to bring Chairman Mao to power on purpose. George Marshall literally put in, he was the Secretary of State and the Secretary of War. He literally put an arms embargo on the freedom fighters in China, the nationalist Chinese under Chiang Kai-shek, for the purpose of bringing the communists to power. We have seen the same thing in South Africa. If you go back to the Bolshevik Revolution, incredible book by Anthony Sutton, one of the greatest historians in American history. He was at Stanford University. He shows that the banking interests on Wall Street literally funded the Bolshevik Revolution. So when you take all these pieces together, what's very clearly happening here is an effort to move away from the old system that was kind of the product of Rome and Greece and the Bible and included things like the sanctity of life and the basic principles that are articulated in our Declaration of Independence. Thou shalt not steal, as in right to property. Thou shalt not murder, as in right to life. So just biblical concepts translated into government. They want all that to go by the wayside, and they want to usher in a new system. And so China is at once the model for this new system and also one of the key engines now moving the world toward that system with help from the UN. And again, I can't emphasize this strongly enough, with help for generations from top American policymakers and top American business interests.
Dolly, Varden. Silver isn't just riding the wave. They're paddling straight into the heart of the storm. Led by a team with over 2 decades of precious metals experience, the company has planted its flag in British Columbia's legendary Golden Triangle, one of the most prolific silver and gold districts on the planet. But what makes Dolly Varden stand out isn't just the grade or the geology, it's the timing. With a fresh NYSE listing, the company is now positioned to tap into a massive pool of U.S. capital, just as investor interest in silver is beginning to reignite. They're cashed up, fully funded, and aggressively exploring, not just sitting on assets waiting for silver to move. They're drilling into high potential targets, like the big bulk porphyry system, and expanding known zones, with the kind of scale that could redefine their resource base. And while others are stuck in the mud, Dolly Varden is cutting accretive deals, building value, and expanding their footprint in a jurisdiction known for political stability and mining support. In a market starved for supply and scrambling for leverage, companies like Dolly Varden become ground zero for the next silver surge. And because when the breakout comes and the price rockets past all-time highs, producers with scale, grade, and jurisdictional safety won't just benefit. They'll lead. And Dolly Varden isn't waiting to catch the trend. They're trying to be the trend.
Good question, Andy. And I think, regardless of who exactly Trump is, I don't think we can exclude entirely the possibility that we've been deceived, although after examining this for about 8 years, I do believe he's seriously trying to stop it. But you look at the economic system that we have right now, and really the monetary system in particular. And I taught economics for 12 years. This has been a fascination of mine since I was in college. It is going to end, right? It was unsustainable from the beginning. It's basically a fraud piled on top of a fraud piled on top of a fraud. And there is no way for this to continue in perpetuity. As you know very well, they create money as debt. They don't create the interest needed to pay back the loans when that money came into circulation through the purchase of bonds. And so this system cannot survive over the long term. And I think we're rapidly approaching the inevitable collapse of this system. And that brings us to a fork in the road. We can go, I think, one of 2 ways, and maybe there are subpaths on each of those 2 broad ways, but there are ultimately 2 ways we could move. We could move in the direction of more centralization, more of the same fraud, maybe repackaged and maybe with a few token concessions to humanity, but an effort to really move us toward a one world monetary system, a one world financial system. And that is ultimately the goal. There may be interim steps to get there, right? The European Union, I think, is a very relevant model when we're talking about steps on the way to that system, where a regional central bank like the European Central Bank usurps the monetary authority from the formerly sovereign governments. But I believe that's the way the globalists want to go. And I first started writing about this early on in my journalistic career. I did a cover story for the New American Magazine, I think back in like 2010, fresh out of journalism school, about the push for a one world currency. And they weren't hiding it. I had 20 UN reports saying we need a one world currency. I had IMF reports saying we need a one world currency. I had a report from the Chinese central bank saying we need a world currency. We should base it on the special drawing rights at the IMF. It's already kind of a proto global currency. All right. So that's what they want. They want to turn the IMF or some substitute for the IMF into a global central bank, kind of Federal Reserve style. Again, there may be some concessions to make people happy. Maybe we'll peg it to gold, or 10% will be gold, or whatever. Maybe some silly little token like that. Then the other option would be to restore sound money. And I do believe that Trump understands this far better than he lets on in public.
While the fundamentals roar louder than ever, the technicals are quietly setting the stage for something big. For weeks, silver has danced along a crucial support zone around $32. It's tested, dipped, and bounced, each time attracting buyers with growing conviction. This isn't random market noise, it's pressure building beneath the surface. Above sits a stubborn resistance at $34, a level that's acted like a brick wall. But here's the thing. The more a ceiling is tested, the weaker it becomes. And once silver punches through $34, the move to $35, even $35.50, could happen in a flash. Why? Because above that point, the chart opens up. No major resistance, just open sky. And every trader watching the same levels knows it. Break $35, and it's not just retail piling in. It's funds, institutions, algo-driven momentum, the kind of surge that creates a parabolic move. But even more important is what's underneath, the 200-day EMA hovering around $31.33, acting like a launch pad. Unless that level breaks, something that currently looks unlikely, silver remains coiled. Sideways action isn't stagnation. It's consolidation. And historically, when silver consolidates at high levels in a bullish macro environment, the breakout isn't just strong, it's explosive. What we're seeing isn't a top, it's a base, a launch zone for the next leg up. And once it lifts off, the speed could leave even veteran investors breathless.
And he's dropped some pretty strong hits. I mean, you go back to 2016 and you listen to him talking about gold and how our purchasing power has been eroded, and how wouldn't it be great to go back to the gold standard. A lot of people don't realize Trump was educated in some very important things by some very important people prior to getting involved in the political process. Roy Cohn is an interesting fellow. He had a long and weird career as a high-powered lawyer for mafia and others, but toward the end of his life, he repented of a lot of that stuff and got really active in the fight for freedom. In fact, he joined the board of the Western Goals Foundation, the largest private intelligence organization in the world, headed at that time by Congressman Larry McDonald, who was the chairman of the John Birch Society. His plane was shot down by a Soviet fighter jet in 1983. And so this was a good friend of Donald Trump's who mentored him on a lot of key things. And they knew everything, right? They had all the files on the subversive movements. They had a very good understanding of the monetary system. So you look at the things that Trump has said over the years. We should go back to the gold standard. He actually took payment for a big space of office space in one of his buildings in the shape of a gold bar. You look at some of the people he has brought around him, right? Judy Shelton, his nominee for the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. That was interesting, right? One of the better known advocates of sound money and gold and gold bonds. So you get the sense that Trump does understand this much better than he lets on in public. And I would like to think, can't be sure, I don't have any secret inside information, but I would like to think that as this system draws to its inevitable close, there are very smart people working on a plan to move us back in the direction of sound money over the long term. Hearing him talk about the gold in Fort Knox, something is up. And again, I think we could go one of two ways. And now would be a really good time for everyday Americans to educate themselves on this. I have spoken with multiple members of Congress who are very enthusiastic about a return of the gold. Obviously, gold would have to be revalued, right? I mean, we couldn't be $3,000 an ounce, $3,300 an ounce, and have that back to U.S. dollar. There would have to be a major restructuring of the system. But I don't think that's out of the question, and I think there are some very influential people who also would like to see those things. But, the future's not written in stone.
And here's the part almost no one is ready for. The greatest wealth transfer in history isn't coming. It's already underway. While average investors chase tech stocks, crypto cycles, and speculative trends, the real smart money is moving in silence. Central banks, sovereign wealth funds, elite family offices, they're all quietly acquiring gold and, more discreetly, silver. They understand the game. They know fiat is dying, and they know that when the reset hits, only hard assets will matter. This isn't about timing the market, it's about front-running a system that's already collapsing. While the media distracts with nonsense, the insiders are preparing for a post-dollar world. A world where paper wealth evaporates and real assets reign. And in that world, silver becomes the gatekeeper. It's portable, liquid, finite, and still affordable, at least for now. But that window is closing fast, because once silver breaks above its suppression zone, the move won't be gradual. It will be violent. Just like in 1980, just like in 2011. Only this time, the setup is far more extreme. We're not just facing inflation or a banking crisis. We're facing systemic failure, a collapse in confidence, a reset of value. And in that reset, those holding real assets won't just survive, they'll thrive. The question is, which side of the transfer will you be on?
Well, that's a good question. I would actually start with the education, right? And a lot of people think that's weird. Why, out of all the issues, would you start with education? I think that is really at the root of our problem. The reason Americans have been so easy to manipulate now over all these decades is because they have not been educated. The so-called education system is right now being not just nationalized, but globalized in a way that is indoctrinating, dumbing down, and sexualizing. And it's not even just the population of the United States anymore, but the whole world. And so I would urge all parents to start off with, in the strongest possible terms, to take immediate action to protect their children from this. I compare the system often to a burning building, right? If the building is burning and your children inside, you don't sign a petition, you don't call your representative, you don't go speak at the school board, you get your child out of the burning building. And so I would start with that. I would definitely spend some time on these monetary issues. If I had to pick the two biggest threats long-term to the survival of liberty, sovereignty, civilization, family, good values, it would be what's happening in the schools and what's happening with the monetary system. So I would certainly spend some time on that. And then I would absolutely share some truths from the Bible with folks and let them know that there are answers to all of those big questions in life that we have been told either not to think about or to come to silly conclusions about. And I would urge people in the strongest possible terms to open up their Bible. Many of your ancestors died so that you could have a Bible today. Many of them were burned at the stake so that you could have a Bible today. So at least do them the courtesy of reading what the Bible has to say. And I think all of us would be better off as a result of that. So those are the three things I would really emphasize. What's happening in the schools, what's happening with the money, and what's happening with the big questions of life. And I think the Bible has good answers actually for all three of those.
Everything is converging. Globalist manipulation, geopolitical conflict, engineered economic collapse, the weaponization of fiat, and a rapidly depleting supply of real assets. This isn't a coincidence. It's a financial reset in real time. And at the heart of it all sits silver, overlooked, undervalued, and on the cusp of a historic revaluation. The push for a new monetary system, the surge in industrial demand, and the death spiral of the dollar are not distant threats. They're current realities. And silver isn't just reacting to these forces. It's being driven by them. $500 silver isn't hype. It's the logical outcome of a system coming apart at the seams. The opportunity is here. The window is narrow, and once it slams shut, the price you see today will be gone forever. If you see what's happening, don't wait for confirmation. Position yourself before the breakout. Because when the dust settles, those who prepared will hold the keys to generational wealth. Make sure you subscribe to stay ahead of the curve. And remember, this is not financial advice. Always speak to a professional before making any investment decisions.